For my manufacturing project this semester, I decided to learn how to create molds and to cast resin in them. As you can see, I made chess pieces. I 3D printed these pieces. The pawn is my own design. I designed it on SolidWorks and I grabbed SolidWorks files of the rest of the pieces from online. 3D printed these pieces so that way I could create my mold. Here I'm cutting the PVC pipe to be able to limit the amount of silicone I use to make my molds around the 3D printed pieces. And at the end of this next clip, I make a vertical cut so I can pull the PVC part to remove the finished molds.
I'm getting ready to hot glue these PVC pipes to cardboard. That way, I'll just put pieces in there, pour the silicone over it, and get the mold.
The types of silicone I'm using is Smooth-On Umu 25. It's a good silicone for beginners. The pot life is about 15 minutes, and that's why I asked for help because I want to make all 6 molds at the same time. I ended up running out of my own silicone, so I had to use the shop silicone, which was EcoFlex. It's also a Smooth-On product. I used the EcoFlex for my pawn and my rook molds, and then I used Smooth-On for Umu 25 from the rest of my molds. The silicone dry for a day, even though it cures in 75 minutes. Removing the PVC was harder than I thought it would be. The clip I'm showing here is a night mold, which was the easiest to get out. The other molds required someone else to pry the PVC open while I pushed the silicone out. So I cut the mold in a jagged line so the mold would line up properly for the resin pour. Okay, so this is a failed rook mold here. I'm gonna have to redo that, but all the other molds turned out great. I'm going to tape the molds up on the cuts that I had to make so that way I can test for leakage with water, and then I'll let the molds dry overnight because the water won't allow the resin to cure, so that way I can pour resin tomorrow. My molds did not leak water once I wrapped them in masking tape and a layer of food plastic wrap just in case. I'm using 2-part epoxy art resin to make my pieces blue. I added some loose powder Urban Decay eyeshadow in the color metal. A little goes a long way for that. After I poured the resin, I tapped the molds on the table to move as many air bubbles to the top as possible. If I ever make more of these pieces, I would pour the resin from higher up so the stream would go into the mold as thin as possible and have less air bubbles. The white mold on the table is one of the EcoFlex molds that I made. The pieces turned out great. There was some flashing that I had to remove from the pieces. The king and queen, however, were my trouble pieces. The tops of my 3D printed pieces ended up being too thin for resin pouring is what I found out. The air bubbles caused the spheres on the queen to not show up, and the crown on the king ended up as 2 separate pieces, so I had to glue that piece onto the main piece. So after demolding these pieces, I cut out green pieces of felt and I hot glued them to the bottom to make them look more professional. This project was very valuable hands-on experience for me, and I can create more of these because now I have the molds.